Hello folk, how you doing? Scotty. So I've done numerous arguments on the economic calculation problem. I had been requested to do a response on Paul Cockshott's argument in relation to do with his argument against von Mises.
Made some striking claims, and if they could be sustained, these would apparently be devastating to the cause of socialism. The dominant Marxian conception of socialism had always involved the abolition of private property and the means of production and the abolition of money. But Mises argued that every step that takes us away from private ownership of the means of production and the use of money also takes us away from economic rationality.
Yeah, this is going to be a very serious problem, especially when you get rid of money. You're inevitably going to be faced with the economic calculation problem.
And when he's talking about rationality, Mises had in mind the problem of producing the maximum useful effect, that is a satisfaction of wants, on the basis of a given set of economic resources. And this is how bourgeois economics still define the problem of economics.
And Ludwig von Mises was absolutely right, but of course they misinterpret things. It's not as simple as just saying, well, you need a certain calculation just for the sake of quantity of output in terms of production. The point being is the fact that you require the information of prices because prices are signals, and the only way that you can tell what consumers want and don't want is through consumers driving what production is. Consumers have to drive what the prices are. This is the very reason why, you see through, price fixing, it ends up creating distortion of such information of profits and losses, and as a result you end up facing resource misallocation into the wrong parts of the market, because without the information of market-driven prices essentially driven by consumers, you wouldn't know what to produce and stop producing, what resources to use and where, you're going to allocate the resources. So in other words, as a result of that, you end up, producing things that the market's not in demand of. But here we go. This is where he gets onto that argument.
They define it as a technical problem rather than studying political economy, which is the relationship between the incomes of social classes.
And what's that got to do with the price of cheese with regards to people's wages, etc.? We're speaking about this to do with the economic calculation problem, which has got nothing at all to do with what people's wages are. But in terms of prices, you require market-driven prices in order to know what consumers' demand is, what consumers want and don't want. The issue being here is the fact that it's a misunderstanding of what prices are, what they convey. When you destroy that information, you don't hold that information. So just have a listen to what he says.
Alternatively, Mises gave the problem in terms of its dual: how to create the most efficient method of production in order to minimise the resources used to produce a given effect.
Well, that's correct. Mises was spot on. At the end of the day, it comes down to that of consumers' demand. They're the ones who determine what prices are. Prices reflect that of the information of consumers' needs and wants. When you reject consumer demand driving production, you're rejecting that of consumers determining what prices are. Without consumer demand determining prices, you don't understand price information signals. You no longer hold the information of consumers' needs and wants.
He repeatedly returns to this latter formulation in his critique of socialism, with examples like building a major railway line or building a house.
In other words, it's really just a question of what's the most efficient way of achieving building the railways, etc., where there's greater demand, etc. It's all these things, and plus the fact you have to look at that resources have alternative uses. And I gave the example how wood has a variety of different uses. So you could use wood for the sake of building bookcases and all different types of items. It's not just you have wood and then it goes into producing one type of thing. There's a variety of different things, and then you've got all the variety of different types of wood to add to that. So things aren't really that simplistic, and you have to know in the market where there is greater demand. Of course, what socialism does is it rejects consumer demand, because socialism is not about consumer driving what production is. And this is why socialism is destructive, because through economic central planning, it rejects consumer demand. So consumers are not the ones driving what profits and losses are. And the whole point of prices is it conveys information. It's just like how I pointed out in the previous argument in relation to do with the economic calculation problem. I spoke about that of Thomas Sowell's example of housing. You've got beachfront housing. The prices are a way to ration scarce resources. So you've only got one beachfront, there's scarcity of space available, not everybody can live on the beachfront because there's not enough room to, there's only so many, beachfront houses you can build, so how then do you determine who gets to live in them without that of favouritism? Well, the only way that you can ration that is through prices. Of course, that's something that Marxists really don't understand because they don't comprehend that to do with scarcity. Socialists think they can live in a post-scarcity world. When it comes to the economic calculation problem, the problem is resource misallocation. That is to say that you've got alternative uses for those resources. So you're not just going to produce bookcases with wood. You're not just going to produce that of bedside cabinets. You've got hundreds of other items. But how do you know what is what in terms of what is in greater demand or not, if not for consumer demand? Well, you don't know. You're just guessing. And plus the fact, not all bookcases are the same style, they're not all the same colour, you've got all the variety of different types of wood on top of that, all the variety of different options, and there is the complexity of the market. Socialists, for the life of them, have no clue over that information.
His claim is that only the market, by reducing all costs and benefits to the common denominator of money, allows rational comparison of alternative ways of doing things.
And his argument is absolutely spot on, because it's the consumers driving what production is, it's consumers determining to the market. So for example, consumers go into stores and they buy goods freely, and without you realising it, at the end of every single month, a business can see what their most bought products are and what their least bought products are. So in other words, businesses can see what products they're selling most of, what products they're not selling. That information is saying to the business, here's where our profits are and here's where our losses are. And in terms of the produce that it's selling, the business knows, therefore, from what its most bought products are, can tell what resources they're going to have to get more of, and where that resource is going to have to be allocated in the market, where there's greater urgency for that in the market. It's just like how Thomas Sowell gave the example office building in Texas for providing petrol to all the variety of different petrol stations across the entire country. Well, you've not only got one petrol station, you might have, hundreds of petrol stations in California alone, never let alone everywhere else across the country, and the demand is very different from station to station. So for example, one petrol station might have in 1 month greater traffic of that of your normal cars that requires the cheaper fuel. The market knows where to allocate that resource, the cheaper fuel, to that specific petrol station, simply because the information of prices conveyed that information. Whereas another petrol station might see heavier traffic of that of sports motors, because, for whatever reason being, maybe there's an event on, who knows what it may be, but it might have heavier traffic of, the sports motors, therefore the market knows where to provide that type of fuel. And then, for whatever reason being, you might find elsewhere in the market greater demand from that of, your truck drivers, etc., that require, things like diesel throughout the month. And even, from month to month, demand changes constantly. For argument's sake, you might have an event that comes along, and an event that might take place that requires heavier traffic of whatever it may be, and therefore a petrol station doesn't have fixed demand. It's not as simple as having fixed demand, and that's one of the major problems with Marxism. If you're going to destroy the information of prices, you're destroying the information that conveys that information. So in other words, central office no longer knows without the information, because they've no money, therefore they've no prices, so they don't know where to allocate the cheaper fuel or the premium fuel for sports cars, where to allocate in the market for diesel. With demand changing constantly across hundreds and hundreds of petrol stations across the length and breadth of the United States of America, how can they tell that information without that of consumers driving prices? So when consumers have high demand for something specific, maybe it's, a large demand of your normal cars getting the normal fuel, going into a specific petrol station, the price drives up to reflect that. Therefore, it's a price signal saying to the market, here is where there's greater demand in this specific petrol station for this specific, type of petrol. Therefore, we know where to allocate that. But as soon as you destroy that information that conveys all of that, then you're faced with a very, very serious problem, because you don't know where you're going to allocate in the market, the diesel, the premium fuel, or even the cheaper fuel for the sake of your ordinary cars. And that's why socialism's destructive.
He asks, how can socialist planners calculate a least cost method of achieving objectives? He goes through a series of ways they might do it and rejects them all. He starts out rejecting Neurath's proposal of calculation in kind on the grounds that you can't add together quantities of different inputs unless you first convert them to a common unit of measurement, like money. That is to say, you can't have a rational way of combining means of production unless you can cost all the means of production in terms of a single unit, like money. If you've followed my videos, and if you watch my video on linear program, you'll see that Kantorovich showed that, on the contrary, you can optimize in kind without money. His optimization procedures don't depend on monetary calculation.
And this is the problem with his argument with regards to Kantorovich, because it's completely and wholly irrational. He's arguing without that of prices. He's got no information to convey. It's just like the example of the petrol stations, etc. Of course, without the information of prices, there is no rational calculation. He thinks it's just a case of centrally planning, through the central planning of such production and technology, then somehow they can know, the information of consumers' needs and wants. How could they? Consumers are not the ones driving production. There's no information of prices there to convey that information. So if there's no information conveying the information of consumers' needs and wants, how do you know the information of consumers' needs and wants? They think they can just somehow plan for that. And how can you plan for that when consumers' demand isn't fixed? When consumers' demand changes constantly, and you've got thousands, in fact millions and millions of different options out there in the market. And to add complexity, out of millions of people, 65 million people in Great Britain alone, and it just, like the argument to do with the subjective theory of value, which of course these socialists try to reject, which is completely irrational. They don't understand that each and every single individual of society all have different value for different products. Everybody holds different value in these different products. It's not as simple as just saying, well, you're just going to centrally plan, because not everybody has the same tastes in things. So then how do you determine what value really is? Especially without that of money. There's the entire issue with that irrational argument. So in other words, he's basically saying a central planner can know your needs and wants without you conveying that information to them. And here's the issue, because your needs and wants are endless. That's what scarcity means. Your demand is far greater than what is actually available to you. And Paul Cockshott really doesn't seem to understand that as soon as you eliminate the consumer, then you're left with a central planner that somehow, knows better for your needs and wants than what you do. Now, what are they going to turn around and say to you? Oh, the technology just somehow gathers this information from consumers' demand. Well, consumers' demand driving what production is isn't socialism. That's capitalism.
All that they require is knowledge of technology and a planned target. And Kantorovich even got a Nobel Prize in economics for proving this, the only socialist economist who ever did.
It doesn't prove a single thing. And from what we've seen of recorded history, economic central planning has been destructive. There's no evidence anywhere on this planet Earth to show for economic central planning leading to this utopian ideal world where you can provide for consumers' needs and wants. It's all theoretical nonsense that's been tried and tried over and over and failed over and over.
The next alternative would be the Labour theory of value, and he rejects that as well, but only in a single sentence.
Well, no wonder he's rejected the Labour theory of value in a single sentence, because it's completely and wholly irrational. You can't fix a price to something and determine a price as if it's knowable based on your labour time, quantity, resources, etc., because value is something subjective.
You can't have market socialism with state ownership but a market operating on the grounds that the market is essentially the pursuit of self-interest. And this, he says, implies the existence of risk-taking entrepreneurs. And if you accept the pursuit of self-interest through the market is necessary for economic calculation, then it's inconsistent to exclude the entrepreneur and inconsistent to exclude private ownership. Now, in view of what happened in China after Mao, this is quite an astute observation. Once the Chinese Communist Party conceded the virtue of the market, it became impossible for it to denounce exploitation, as this was dressed up as enterprise on the part of those for whom it was glorious to get rich, according to Deng. He argues against the differential equations of mathematical economics as a technique for socialist economic calculation. You have to realize that Mises was coming from the Austrian school, which is the extreme far right of economics, well to the right of mainstream neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economists were willing to concede that socialist calculation was possible because they had constructed a theory of general equilibrium, which they said was a universal law of economics, and therefore, if it was a universal law of economics, socialist planners could apply it as well. Austrian school are so far to the right that they denounce Adam Smith as opening the door to socialism. The gist of Mises' argument is that the equilibrium condition described in neoclassical economics is an entirely abstract construction and it never actually occurs. Now, there's some reality to this, but it doesn't prove that it's impossible to plan how to make the best use of current resources to achieve a given future output.
Yes, it does. And it rejects it because you require the information of consumers driving what profits and losses are. And if you don't have the information of consumers driving what profits and losses are, then you don't understand the information of consumer demand. And that's the only rational way that you can know the information of what you're going to produce more of and stop producing. It's the only way that you can know the information over what resources to use, how much of it to use, where you're going to allocate it in the market, where you're going to stop allocating. The only way that you'll know that information is consumer demand, because consumers are not fixed. Consumers are not all the same. We all have different needs and wants. It's impossible for you to calculate production and plan production for society because we're not a group. We're individuals with all different needs and wants, and our needs and wants are far surpassed anything of the knowledge that you could ever hold. Not even technology could ever do that. So Mises was absolutely correct in what he's stating. So I don't know where you're going with this term, extreme far right, as if to try and discredit it, because you haven't even got a single example in recorded history of where your economic central planning in any level, even within a mixed economy, trying to fix prices, where that actually worked. It never. Every single time you've resorted to that of resource misallocation.
Let's consider what a socialist planning agency knows. The socialist planning agency can calculate the labour content of all the means of production. It knows the number of labour tokens that each consumer good will fetch in the market on sale to individuals. And if it knows both of those, it can compare the cost of producing something to society with the social valuation that the consumers place on it.
Well, how could it? I mean, this is what Paul Cockshott doesn't understand. What he's arguing here is based on consumer demand, and consumer demand has got absolutely nothing to do with socialism. The only reason why you saw in the Soviet Union individuals going into stores and buying goods, the Soviet Union could not rid itself of capitalism 100%. It could not achieve its utopian goal of its Marxist theoretical pish, basically. It was impossible because they couldn't get rid of the market. Where it became strongly socialist in its central planning was all the control over prices, etc., trying to fix prices to determine what would get produced, etc., etc. So the central planner was the one determining in terms of production. How can you rationally calculate production without market-driven prices? Profits is information telling the market what to produce more of, how much to produce, what resources to use, what resources, where to allocate the resources, what to invest more in, and even how the resources are going to be transported. Losses is telling the market what to stop producing, what resources to stop using, where to stop allocating the resources in the market. So in other words, if you don't hold the information of profits and losses, how the hell, in the absence of prices, does the central planner know in terms of calculation for what to produce and what to stop producing without consumers determining that information? All you've done is bastardized the entire meaning of socialism and tried to correlate that with consumer demand. Socialism's got nothing to do with consumer demand.
Leontiev gave you a way of deriving the gross outputs of an economy given the net final demand.
So the problem with this equation that William Paul Cockshott's trying to argue is the fact that he's trying to fit in the total demand. But in order for there to be total demand, there needs to be a style of economy where there is consumer in demand. How does a central planner, without consumer demand determining production, rationally calculate and determine what gets produced and what doesn't without the information of profits and losses? They don't know. It's not as simple as just saying, here's total demand, end of story. Because it's not some fixed quantity. It's not, demand isn't something fixed. It's not something you can just determine as if it's an absolute. Demand far exceeds that of the supply of what's available. Demand is endless. Again, that's on the basis as if to say, all consumers have the same demand, and they don't, because we're not a society, we're made up of individuals. But again, consumption goods is based on the premise that you have consumers driving what production is. You require a market, which is of course against socialism.